The fantasy season is a cruising, ladies and gentlemen. We are on to week 6 with the wide receiver projections. There's a lot to cover, so let's just get through the mise en place here to get everything set up for my rankings. First of all, I will go through some of my projections, the top 47 players in my projections. There are over 100 players that I have projected, ranked. I'll go over, obviously it's really my rankings that we're going over, but my projections are on the screen, and I'll go through all of that in just a moment. But you can find all of this on the website, www.theffforge.com, where you can find all of my rankings. They get updated throughout the week. So if you want my final rankings, you can come visit me a half hour prior to the, I almost called it the Jacksonville game, the overseas game, in the morning, and I'll also be here 1 hour prior to kickoff for the main slate of games. What are we looking at on the screen here as far as my projections go? Obviously, they will go in order of my rankings, and I will cover them in that order. But right here where I have this highlighted, oh gosh. So right here where I have this highlighted, unfortunate spoiler alert there, this coloring here, red means hot. A hot matchup is a good thing. That means that player is primed and ready to have an above average game thanks to some of these surrounding factors and just their pure skill set. If it is white, that just means amongst all of the other matchups and whatnot this week, it's a normal average matchup, and if it gets down to the dark blues, then it's a cold matchup. The brighter the red, the darker the blue, the more intense of how good or bad, poor the matchup is for these players. Then, of course, we have the player name, the team that these on, and then most people, everybody if not, gives you a single projected number, which is essentially just the average expectation of what that player will score that week based on the inputs. Some are more accurate than others, but at the end of the day, they're all just coming to some sort of average. You have fractions of touchdowns included in there and whatnot. And I'm not saying I don't have fractions of touchdowns included in my projections. However, I give you an expected range essentially based on what they've done and what their opponent has done up to this point in the season. What is a below average performance up to an above average performance, not an amazing performance, not a very, very bad performance, just the expected range of performances that you can expect for each player. And that's what you are seeing on the screen. And then, of course, you have their opponent farthest to the right. So we will come right back to my rankings. But before we get into them, let's recap week 5 and how I did with my DFS plays, which I will give you at the end of this video for my wide receivers for week 6, and how I did with my love'ems and my fade'ems, which will come out throughout the video for this week. Overall, I think I did pretty darn good. At the bottom of the barrel, we have Darnell Mooney. He had cost $3,900, so bottom of the barrel, just cheaper priced guys, and he was very close to having a good day several times, but he came through with a big old goose egg, unfortunately. At the mid-tier price point for $5,000, I said Marquise Brown. He ended up as the wide receiver 17 on the week, not really going to help you win the biggest of competitions, but at least help you place, especially in smaller tournaments, so it came through all right for the cost. He would have been a value for the points to cost ratio there. And for a contrarian play, which I really don't know at the end of the week if it was a contrarian play or not, but for $5,700, I thought DeAndre Hopkins was an excellent buy, and he tied for wide receiver 7 on the week. It did help you win some matchups. As far as my love'ems last week, I gave you 2 top 10 wide receivers in Jacoby Myers and DeAndre Hopkins yet again, and I give you a surprise wide receiver 23 performance from Rashee Rice. So my love'ems nailed them all, I think. And for my fade'ems, I had Calvin Ridley, who ended up as the wide receiver 9. So didn't nail that one, but then we came through strong with Chris Olave, who finished as the wide receiver 33, and Cortland Sutton, who finished as the wide receiver 80. And now it is time to get to the rankings. There's a lot to cover. All right, so we've got my first tier here, starting off from wide receiver 1 through 12. Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs at wide receiver 2, followed by Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Keenan Allen, Puka Nacua, A.J. Brown, Devontae Adams, C.D. Lamb, DJ Moore, Mike Evans, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And I think that all these guys are must-starts this week. Don't need to talk too much about them, but a couple of quick notes on some of them. As far as Cooper Kupp being the highest for me, it just comes down to him having the safest and highest floor, in my opinion. Keenan Allen, there's just no chance that you could sit him. I could see some people maybe questioning that going up against Dallas, but no way. Mike Evans, I think that he is a must start. He was probably been overperforming up to this point in the season, though, given that he is ranked second via my EV system. My EV system is similar to average fantasy points per week. However, it loves consistency. If you take a player who scores 60 points, 0 points, and a player who scores 20 points in those same 3 weeks, that player who scored 20 points would be ranked higher via the amount of points that my system would give them. And so that's where Mike Evans is still ranked second so far on the season. However, the projections put him more as a high-end wide receiver 2 compared to an absolute stud top 3 kind of wide receiver. I do still like him obviously quite a bit this week. I like the matchup, and I just don't see how I could sit him given how he has performed, even if he's been overperforming this season. Worst case scenario, he misses the moon and he falls amongst the stars. Should be all right. Then Amon-Ra St. Brown, obviously I'm ranking him as if he's playing. That is the current expectation at this point in time. I do want to warn you to keep your expectations lower than normal, however, for Amon-Ra St. Brown. When I looked into the injury that he had, which we don't know the specific injury that he had, however, typically an abdominal injury does cause a player to be less productive for a period of time, even after they're back onto the field and healthy. So just keep that in mind for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Maybe take a guy who has a little bit more of a higher ceiling and a less of a floor if you're choosing between two players outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, because Amon-Ra St. Brown might not give you quite as high of a week as you're hoping for or expecting. That is all. Still a must start for me. Let's move on to my second tier, which is a big and wild tier. And this tier is going to start off at wide receiver 13 at Adam Thielen. I'm pretty much going to talk about every guy, so I'm just going to announce the position of them as I talk about them. Adam Thielen is ranked 13th via my EV system, equalized value, just went over that. And the projections all have him as a wide receiver 1 kind of player this week. It's a solid but not great matchup versus Miami. I expect him to once again get peppered with plenty of targets, giving him as high of a floor as anyone. He has earned a love him tag for me for week 6 here, going up against Miami. I love him. Then moving on to DK Metcalf at wide receiver 14. I nearly faded DK Metcalf, but I had other more important fades to make, so ended up taking him off of my fade list. He has overperformed so far on the seasons. My projections have him as a high-end wide receiver 3 based on what we should expect. However, the EV system, based on what he has done this season, has him ranked as a high-end wide receiver 2. He's a 14th best on the season so far, wide receiver. Then for Brandon Ayuk, I have him ranked 15th this week. Once again, these are all subject to change, and Ayuk is not somebody I feel comfortable about. But comparing him to Michael Pittman, who I have ranked 16th, I would play Ayuk over Pittman if I had that choice on my roster, but I would not feel good about it, and there's a chance by the end of the week I wouldn't do that. If all I was looking for was a higher and safer floor this week, then I would just go with Pittman and accept it if Ayuk happened to go off of my bench, but Cleveland's good against wide receivers. I expect this to be, I think I say this for a different player later on. Deebo Samuel is, I have this written down for him, but let's just say it now. I expect that the receivers for San Francisco will have a similar week to last week. The game plan will be similar on offense. Guys like Christian McCaffrey, who didn't end up blowing up last week, but the ancillary players, and that sounds wrong, and whatever. The non-wide receiver players for the team, I expect to help to carry San Francisco to a win against Cleveland compared to the wide receivers like they do against weaker opponents. As far as Michael Pittman so far, he has underperformed. He could have been better for you based on the underlying stats going into this week. Via my projections, he's a middling to high-end wide receiver 2. However, via my EV system, he has been a middling wide receiver 3. So that would make him, according to my projections, an underperformer so far this season. Then we have Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith at wide receiver 17 and 18 respectively. And a little comparison between the two. I'm not excited to play either of them. Not even a comparison. Just either of them. I'm not too excited, but I'm also not prepared to give up on either of them quite yet. The matchups are not good either, unfortunately, so I would not argue with you if you decided that you wanted to sit one of them for someone that's at least in the same tier for sure. I wouldn't argue against. I mean, I could give you arguments for it, but I would be fine if you chose to play other guys in these same tiers over these players. Then Christian Kirk in at wide receiver 19. His role appeared to be intact with the return of Zay Jones last week in comparison to what his role looked like in week 1. I don't know that that's a for sure thing since Zay Jones wasn't in for the entirety of the game, but Zay Jones is day-to-day, and if he plays, unlike last week, I will not be lowering, at least I don't think I will, my Jacksonville wide receivers and tight end because Zay is back. But that might just be a this week thing. It still leads to, I think, inconsistency among the wide receiver core when they have all 4 of their primary receivers working. ETN's gotten involved a little bit more heavily than I expected as well up to date. So maybe that's where the Zay Jones targets come back from and ETN starts to have fewer targets. That would be possible and keep all these receivers more viable on a weekly basis, more trustworthy. Then at wide receiver 21, I have Marquise Brown, and he is a fade for me. I am concerned about the ripple effect that the loss of James Conner will have for this entire offense. He was the glue that kept this offense going. Joshua Dobbs is going to have much more pressure on himself to make this team run, and that's also just going to make defenses, it's going to make it easier for them to key in on him. The Rams have only allowed the 6th most fantasy points to receivers on the season. That said, they're not a secondary that necessarily frightens you or wants to keep you away from playing a player. So, you're still probably playing Marquise Brown this week against the Rams, but just be aware, going forward, it may not be as good as it has been up to this point in the season. Then we have Nico Collins at wide receiver 22, Jacoby Myers wide receiver 23, and not unlike Michael Pittman, both of these guys actually might have more left in the tank than you've gotten from them so far this season. They project better than they have performed up to this point. New Orleans and New England, their opponents have not been dominant against wide receivers either. I feel like those are 2 names where you hear them and you think, oh God, that's a terrible matchup. But they have not been terrible matchups. They've been pretty much middling matchups. And that's going to bring us to Garrett Wilson in at my wide receiver 24. And I would love to be higher on Garrett Wilson this week going up against Philadelphia. Philadelphia has been a top 5 matchup for receivers up to this point in the season. It's just really hard to trust the quarterback there. So concerned, optimistic, all those things for Garrett Wilson this week, and it makes him a little bit tough for me to rank. Hopefully this is about appropriate. Then Jordan Addison at wide receiver 25 is going to obviously have an increased opportunity with Justin Jefferson being out, and it is a great first matchup this week going up against Chicago that he can hopefully take advantage of. And then we have another little comparison here between Gabe Davis and Chris Olave. Really tough for me to pick which one I wanted to have higher. Obviously, I should probably have a fade on Chris Olave given the difference where I have him ranked compared to where the ECR is almost certainly going to be on him, where the experts on average have him ranked. In the event that you were to have these two, if you needed a floor, I would go with Chris Olave. If you needed a ceiling, I would go with Gabe Davis. Then Deebo Samuel at wide receiver 28, and just like Ayuk, I don't like the matchup. I already talked about that. Let's move on to wide receiver 29 with Zay Flowers, and Zay was on the edge of having a boom week last week. There's another opportunity for that to come through this week going up against Tennessee. Not the best matchup, but not a bad matchup at all for wide receivers. So I love Zay Flowers this week. Surprise, surprise. That will bring us to my third tier of wide receivers. I'm going to start to not cover every single wide receiver here at this point, but wide receiver 30, I have Chris Godwin. At wide receiver 31, I have Tyler Lockett, and so far, Tyler Lockett has underperformed on the season. The projections have him as a borderline wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. However, my EV system has all the way back as nearly a wide receiver 5. So has not been great for him so far, but there are some reasons to be optimistic about him. Tutu Atwell in at wide receiver 32 is a fade for me, and I'm going to be looking to push him further down in my rankings. I actually think I have him ranked higher than the average expert, but the matchup against Arizona is fantastic, and I do like the fact that there's a distraction, for defenses having to worry about Puka and Cooper Kupp on the other side of the field, and I think that can open up things for Tutu Atwell, and we saw that happen last week. However, I think in this matchup, Arizona is such an easy target that we might see, Cooper Kupp have a Jamar Chase-like day, and it just might be so easy that there's no need to get fancy and throw to Tutu Atwell because your primary two wide receivers are getting open so often. And so I think the amount of opportunities are going to be low. There's not going to be any kind of trick plays, which is probably your Tutu Atwell play. I think it'll be a pretty straightforward, don't want to put too much on tape and just beat the defense for this LA Rams offense. Moving on to wide receiver 33, we have DeAndre Hopkins, and at wide receiver 34, Amari Cooper. And so I'm ranking Cooper as if Watson is out, and PJ Walker is going to be the quarterback in that case, going up against San Francisco. Is that right? Don't like that very much anyways. It still feels a little bit too high for me, honestly, as assuming that PJ Walker is there. So we'll see where Amari Cooper ends up by Sunday. Definitely a candidate to be moved around lower. Then Drake London, followed by Michael Thomas. Cortland Sutton at wide receiver 37. Don't love the matchup there, but, maybe it's all right. And then KJ Osborne at wide receiver 38. And there is a lot to like about Osborne with Justin Jefferson being out and going up against Chicago, just like his counterparts there in Jordan Addison. Still, I don't trust KJ Osborne completely. He has too many drops for me, and he just doesn't show up in games sometimes. And so there's a little bit of boom or bust factor to him. But going up against Chicago, I think you can start him with confidence, essentially as confident as you can ever be in starting KJ Osborne. And that's going to bring us up to our last tier. Maybe I wrote a little bit something about everybody here. So at wide receiver 39, we have Terry McLaurin. He's a fatum for me this week. Atlanta has allowed the third least points to wide receivers on a weekly basis. We see this ball getting spread around week in and week out to everybody around in that wide receiver core. So I just don't see the ceiling for him. Neither do the projections or the expected range, especially based on what he's done so far this season. So I'm trying to stay away from that if possible. I don't think I would play him. Then Rashee Rice I have in at wide receiver 40, and just him versus Josh Downs. A very close call here on who I wanted to put higher, and it's one of those ceilings or floor things. And at this point, if I'm choosing somebody, I essentially just want to go for the ceiling most times. Not in every scenario, though. That depends on what's happening with your roster, your matchup throughout the week. But I like the ceiling for Rashee Rice here more going up against Denver than I do for Josh Downs going up against Jacksonville. But I do like them both a fair bit this week. I think they both have good opportunities to succeed. Then and Rashee Rice was almost a love him for me. And when I was thinking about that, I was also like, maybe Josh Downs should be the love him over him. So very, very close there. Josh Reynolds is my wide receiver 42, and I'm slightly optimistic about him based on my suspicions about Amon-Ra St. Brown maybe not being at physically limited, essentially. Being physically limited, not being at 100%. That might just open up a target or two more for Josh Reynolds throughout a game. And Tampa Bay is a fine matchup for wide receivers. And Jerry Jeudy in that wide receiver 43, and I kind of glossed past this when talking about Cortland Sutton, said I don't really like that matchup a whole lot. But at the end of the day, Kansas City is not a bad matchup for wide receivers. Doesn't mean that it's a good matchup, but it's not a bad matchup. So I'm just ranking Jerry Jeudy based on how he's performed this season. I'm probably lower than the ECR on him. My EV system, equalized value, has him as the wide receiver 49, and my projections had him as the wide receiver 46. So I have him a little bit higher than that, but not too much higher because, frankly, he just hasn't done a whole lot. And personally, I don't love the matchup. I like the upside in a Kansas City matchup, but they've been pretty darn good this season. Then we have DJ Chark here in a good matchup against Miami, and I'd be willing to give him a go this week. If Carolina wants to have a shot against Miami, then they're going to need to do more than just dumping the ball off to Thielen all day. They're going to do that, but they're going to need more, and so I think that that's DJ Chark, not Moore anymore. DJ Moore. It felt better in the head there. That was off the cuff. Wide receiver 45, Joshua Palmer. I don't fully trust him in fantasy, kind of like a KJ Osborne type thing, and it's a tough matchup for him going up against Dallas on top of that, so not too optimistic about him this week. Wide receiver 46, I have Kendrick Bourne as a love him. What is going on? The world is falling apart. Yeah, I don't know. I got a feeling here. Going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, it's an above-average matchup via the numbers. However, I think that Vegas is more than an above average matchup. I think it's a good matchup for wide receivers, and I like Kendrick Bourne to have a repeat of his week 1 performance. He projects better than this, but I'm sure that the week 1 performance of his is absolutely propping that up quite a ways. Still, if you've been holding on to him and or if you need an emergency play this week, I think you could do worse than Kendrick Bourne, and in fact, I think there's a good shot that Kendrick Bourne will come through for you and shock your opponent. And then at wide receiver 47, we have Curtis Samuel. He is forever on the waiver wire and available, and he is quite the opposite of what Kendrick Bourne is on the spectrum of boomer bustness and whatnot. If you need a safe emergency play, your team goes off on Thursday night and or your opponent's team has a terrible Thursday night for some players, Curtis Samuel is always a solid option if you just need 7+ fantasy points. However, this may not be the best week to play him. He is going up against Atlanta. As I mentioned earlier, I think they were a top 3 defense as far as how good they are against wide receivers and the amount of fantasy points allowed so far per week. So I may need to lower Curtis Samuel a little bit in my rankings. I will definitely look into that. That is the rankings. Those are the rankings. So there you go. That's a good little snapshot to keep on the screen while we go over my DFS buys for week 6. And at the bottom of the barrel, I've got Darnell Mooney again at $3,700. Just missed him a couple of times. Isn't he more expensive this week than last week after a 0-point performance? So it's a good matchup, and I expect them to. That could happen again. Like, defenses are obviously going to have to be concerned about DJ Moore. That was my thought going into the season of why I liked Darnell Mooney more than most experts. And so we'll see if that doesn't start to come through, and it almost started to come true last week. At the mid-tier price, and I'm going to give you 2 names this week. I like to try to stick to one because it just starts to get complex, but I can't always help myself. And I do, as much as I'm not in love with KJ Osborne, and this is true of both Minnesota wide receivers, but I had to pick one, and at the price of $4,400 DK dollars, I really like KJ Osborne this week. I think he's a good shot to take for that mid-tier pricing, and just a little bit more expensive, but still in that mid-tier at $5,900 DK bucks. We got one of my loves here in Adam Thielen. For $5,900, you can get basically a wide receiver 1, I think, at the when everything is said and done at the end of the week. Let's go. And for my contrarian play, I doubt Jonathan Mingo is on many people's radars. He's at $3,500 is what you would pay for him. He projected really well. It stunned me to a certain extent. He has had more than 5 receptions, or like 6, 7, and 8 receptions in 3 or 4 games so far, something like that. So he has had a good amount of receptions, and I believe I like the matchup this week for Carolina, right? Yeah, of course. Going up against Miami. So it's a high upside matchup. I think this could be one of those weeks where Jonathan Mingo has a good week. It's very possible. Hopefully not to the detriment of my boy, Adam Thielen, but still for DFS, I like it. Thank you very, very much. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you are not subscribed yet. And my running backs video will come out in the morning, and then my tight ends video will come out on Friday morning. But don't be afraid. The tight end rankings will be up as of some point after my running backs video has been posted. I'm sure probably take me until Thursday tomorrow to get those up. Thank you very, very much. And I appreciate you all. Over 400 subscribers. Freaking awesome. Peace out.